will not pronounce her surname for fear of mispronunciation. So Dr. Dina is an academic in higher education studies at Queen's University Belfast, Northern Ireland, and an honorary supervisor on Liverpool University's Higher Education Doctoral Program UK. She is also a research associate for the chair for the critical study of higher education transformation at Nelson Mandela University, South Africa. And prior to this, she was a senior lecturer at the Center for Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. Dina read for her transdisciplinary PhD in Kingston University in London, and her background is in fine arts, having taught fine art studio practice as a practicing artist. This interest in creative arts education and the burdens of representation has continued in much of her research, from arts-based research approaches through to research into the hidden curriculum and assessment in creative arts education. Dina's work relates to the urgency and ethical historical responsibility of artists and academics in contexts undergoing the transitions in authority and in the shadow of oppression. Shaped in part by her experiences as a practitioner in creative arts education and later in academic development in her country of South Africa, she is concerned with the complexity of the conditions which may enable the development of artists and academics' critical consciousness within institutions and when positioned on the periphery or displaced. She is committed to the growth of Pan-African and international networks for advancing critical university studies, where committed scholars, practitioners, and policymakers across the globe actively pursue an emancipatory imagination for future university. Then our discussant is Dr. Marguerite Muller, who is a lecturer in the School of Education, Communication and Society at King's College London and a research fellow in the Faculty of Education at the University of the Free State. Prior to joining KCL, Marguerite was a lecturer in education studies at the UFS, and she holds a BA in Fine Arts, a postgraduate certificate, a Master of Education, and a PhD in Higher Education Studies. In her research, she employs narrative, participatory, and arts-based inquiry to explore issues of educator identity and subjectivity and social change in higher education. Marguerite uses post-qualitative and arts-based approaches to research inquiry to explore education and subjectivity in relation to globalization, internationalization, mobility, and global South-North knowledge exchange. Her goals are to engage in innovative and accessible and creative scholarship of education that contributes to a fair and just society for all. So welcome both our speaker and our discussant. So just a few house rules. Please, those joining us online, ensure that your microphones are turned off. So the speaker will be given 30 minutes to give her presentation, and the discussant will be given approximately 10 minutes to give their response and feedback. Then the final 20 minutes of this DBT will be for questions and comments. So in case you have any contributions or any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. During the conversation, you're able to drop those comments and questions, and you'll be able to respond to them at the end of the presentation. Then after, when we open the Q&A, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And if it's a 10, feel free to also turn on your camera so I can at least see the person that we're talking to. So at this point, I hand over to the speaker. 2 minutes before the end of time, I'll give you a signal so that you are aware. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Daizy, for chairing the session. For Nella for inviting me. And it's really nice to be contributing to the seminar series, especially for a center that's doing so much exemplary work in higher education studies. Marguerite, was really lovely to hear your bio, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I can see some familiar names in the room, and I'm really grateful for that because this is a new space for me. So thank you. I'll be exploring some of the possibilities offered through figurative representation and the creative arts. when responding to the question of impact in critical higher education studies. It's important to establish some shared understanding of terms before we really begin. So firstly, the question, what is impact? Well, dissemination and impact relate, but in this instance, I'm trying to make a distinction. Dissemination is when we share our research findings or insights with academic communities so that the contribution is registered, engaged with, and hopefully utilized to build on or question knowledge. When we disseminate in this way, we publish in journals or books, perhaps do videos or infographics or social media feeds to increase readership. We present in conferences and we get to talk like we're doing today. Our imagined audience are academics, and our intended contribution is to advance academic knowledges. But the distinction to be made with impact is the prioritization of how what we've learned forms or informs changes outside of academic knowledge. For some, it's the third mission of research following research. So to do this work, one can't just share an academic text like a paper, because most non-experts, those not steeped in the ways of our field, can't access them anyway because of barriers to access from publishing houses. But also, we most often write with the language and lexicons in our field, and so we're heavily enculturated. Anyway, that's not the issue for this presentation. But most of us, I presume, engaging today are doing this because we either have a belief in the importance of what we're looking at, or because we're deeply concerned about its problematics. And we want to change beyond the abstraction of academic contribution. I don't know how many of you came into this field, but I admit to feeling that it chose me, not me it. As Daizy read out, I was lecturing in fine art practice when I moved over, or I guess rather expanded, to higher education studies. And it was in part because of the love-hate relationship that I was forming with the institution of higher education and my realization of its systemic and potentially transformative role within post-apartheid South Africa. So impact's been a concern of mine for a while, I guess. I had thought how it might be enabled to some extent through praxis within research, with a research process, and through my teaching practice, which on reflection, I think was somewhat more possible when working within formal education programs aimed at academics within South Africa. I do think it happened in that way, but as I'll share with you, even then I started being concerned that the usual routes that we use into thinking and doing of formal education weren't quite enough. I've also observed and been frustrated by the difficulties of having meaningful impact when undertaking institutional research, when undertaking research for learned societies, and when bringing together data and research findings to inform recommendations and policy making. So some of you may know this, but in the UK, impact is a large part of one's academic practice as a researcher, and it's somewhat validated through funding, specifically for what's called Pathways to Impact, for the development of impact case studies, which are submissions that go to their research assessment process, a bit like the National Research Foundation in South Africa. It's called the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework here, through which departments, not individuals, receive state fundings. And in some institutions, impact is also validated through promotions processes. There are also staff within research development offices whose role it is to facilitate the pathways to impact in various disciplines and fields in each institution, which is laudable. Chris Brink was a proponent of institutionalizing this push in the UK. Of course, it has become something to game and quantify for the strategic, but it also provides good opportunities and enablements for those of us who genuinely wish to affect or inform change through our work. When I started my time here in Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, which was in early 2017, I soon realized that despite the dominant discourse of community engagement and the erosion of the ivory tower in South Africa, when it came to research, the push was more towards publications and less the impact of such research. There are, of course, reasons for that, including the need to assert legitimacy intellectually in geopolitics. But regardless, the impact agenda in terms of research is not as structurally enabled in South Africa and in many parts of the majority world. Despite that, of course, we have amazing academics who manage this, from whom we can learn. So I hope this distinction between dissemination and impact is of value. I'll share some of the examples as I go, but the question really is, within critical higher education studies, how might one look at the question of impact? Mainstream research in higher education has many forms, but the most middle of the road is that commissioned by institutions for themselves, forms of data collection or evaluation or surveillance. Then for agencies that serve collectives of institutions, or perhaps the state, if we're talking about public higher education, which again will most often get large data sets with usually quantifiable data from various stakeholders. The interests of such works that such work serves are for the institution or the interests of the state. There's also smaller scale work such as self-evaluation of individual agents, teachers, or leaders who collect and reflect on data, hopefully to inform their practice, or for quality assurances, process, or performance management. And of course, there's the work that happens within the scholarship of teaching and learning. In many ways, such work is commissioned, if not financially, then through the direction of those who wish to monitor, measure, survey. And this policy research relationship actually makes it a lot easier for Pathways to Impact to inform change. But it doesn't always lead to change, because those in those positions may not be interested in change, but rather maintaining or assuring the quality of the status quo. So to try and keep my definitions crisp while we all talk here today, critical higher education studies is, I guess, a loose term which delineates that which comes from critical traditions of scholarship and social movements that have sought to operate in the interests of those and that whose power is undermined, including knowledges, peoples, social groups, non-human animals, and the environment. So the issue of power, change, and interests is important. Of course, there are individual agents, collectives, and even institutions that seek to upturn established power dynamics, and so may welcome such research. There have been moments in South Africa where this is the case. Perhaps you feel it now. I'm outside of the loop. Which is why I think the field within South Africa is so robust and making strides in relation to some of the most tough questions that we have to face. Certainly, where there is a critical mass, one sees such a drive, such as with critical race theory in the US and abolitionist studies. Added to this is critical university studies, which is a space myself and other colleagues on the Advancing Critical University Studies network are trying to push to its limits, because our commitment is to the emancipatory intent and imagination of such critique. I term an aspect of such critical higher education studies operative criticism in my work, which is an approach to criticism that is concerned with how our research, our epistemologies, our practices, etc., of higher education studies operates in context, in translation, and intertextually. And a part of this is really where the conversation is today. How does our research operate? Does it inform change? How can we share with each other how we work in our different ways and how that work can be impactful? And when not, why not? So in disciplines or fields or inquiry that are not about the university, impact is most interpreted as about the non-academic communities. For us, it is about academic communities and sometimes their relation to each other, students, cleaners, academics, leaders, donors, governing bodies, whatever. the relation of the university to its public through its various forms of education, research, and third mission, including a few others, such as its role as critical consciousness or authority in relation to the state and global powers, and also business. It may be at a micro level, it may extend right up to the macro. However, when it comes to impact, the question remains about the impact higher education studies has on higher education. And I hope we have the time and you have the desire to discuss the ways in which you've tried this. But I've tried various ways and realized more and more that this is no endeavor for simplicity or naivety. We really need academic street smarts. So I'm going to share on the screen really quickly, just to give you a glimpse of some different approaches I've made in some projects. These projects were, all this research was empirical, quite conventional, some was mixed methods. I was really trying all the right moves for legitimacy and what I thought would be impactful. So these were about the ways in which discrimination is embodied within the staff composition. This is those within the education discipline across the UK, about the system not changing enough, in this case, South Africa, about the politics of belonging when change is not systemic, but about inclusion. This is South Africa and in India. About the implementation of development when it's really meant to be about systemic transformation. Also, governance and leadership when about academic citizenry and academic unfreedom. And also about those in assigned leadership and their resistance, the last ones about the Indian context. So these were, I guess, good papers, to be sure, but the question of impact is the concern here, because I think they've had very little impact. They do lay bare the issues and the ugliness, and so there's witnessing here, but they don't offer the counter narratives for hope and collective growth and resistance. We have, in the research teams, we've done talks, we've offered meetings, we've written policy briefs. I'll share some examples from two contexts. So this was a policy brief for the Northern Irish Department of the Economy, which oversees higher education in this country. For the Northern Ireland Affairs, which is active in Westminster in England. And a policy brief shared after a presentation to a committee concerned with transformation at the very top of a South African university. You can see accessible visuals, clear indications of recommendations, and mostly layperson's wordings. But I also want to stress that timing and authority, by that I don't just mean the authority of the institutions or those in assigned leadership roles, but the authority of the authorship that we have as researchers, which is really disputed and often weak in context with legacies or continued practices of discrimination. These play a role in impact, but I feel that we very rarely acknowledge it in our writing. And I think there should be more acknowledgement. Here you can see how I tried to resist the simplistic assertions that were suggested by reviewer 2. So I found that when I did some of this work within smaller institutions with powerful agents in well-placed positions, then there was a response, at least, to the request for a meeting or a circulation of a policy brief or a paper. That usually happened in institutions when the dominant narratives were in support of transformation, such as in South Africa, or in counter spaces, such as in women's studies in India. Now, in a project that I'm doing in Northern Ireland on the marginalization of research about ethnic minorities, migrants, and racializations here, it's really painful to see the difference when there's little to no political will and also a lack of salience with the dominant discourses of the country. It's sort of a cultural hegemony that happens over research, policy, practice, and the political imagination. And it's being cited by the researchers who are my participants as heavily influential on the impact of their research findings. It creates tensions about whose interests you serve when you adopt the discourses and the ways of thinking of those in power, which may not accord with your politics, that of your participants, or those whose lives or knowledges you're trying to benefit. This is probably the most clear for me when working with academics in exile looking at higher education, which is the case with some of my Syrian collaborators, whose research is being actively ignored by the powers that be on the international stage. But I imagine you might also feel it, I know I do, in the self-surveillance that we practice, the professional risks that we feel when being critical of the institution in the broadest sense or specific institutions that we're studying. So I'd argue that we can and we should understand the dynamics that impact on our work. As we are self-critical, of course, we can't just sit back because of the myriad of reasons why impact is not structurally enabled, supported, or validated. The lack of impact undermines our work. It makes us seem at worst like impimpi, often like careerists, vultures, colonists, putting all of our energies into the extractions that benefit us rather than those that we profess to care for. We lose credibility, our participants lose hope, and in such ways we can land up contributing to the harms that they're enduring. This is a quote from a study that I did with Dr. Tondlana to give you a sense of how this disquiet within mainstream higher education studies shaped the initiation of a project. Critical higher education studies must do more when it comes to impact, otherwise it risks colluding with the culture of impunity in many universities. So why would I have a beef with narrative realism? Well, I'm using this as an umbrella term for various forms to suggest that when we represent our research in many higher education contexts, it's narrative realism that is the most validated. Narrative realism is a way of representation that strives to remove doubt, to assert a credibility and accuracy of what is presented, to remove interpretations, to avoid the interruption of its realism. The writing, the tables, the references to concepts or data are as close to the represented object as truth as possible. This falls within the Anglo-American tradition of those disciplines that worked close to the state or dominating power or which served them, and constructs research as an assured evidence base, the writer as authority, expert knower, or omniscientist, although lately some will include maybe a positionality statement to assert their innocence or by way of apology. It constructs the reader in a passive role with its often didactic, clear, patronizing, accessible means of representation. Underpinning all of this is a collegial rationality model that is related to the failed Western myth of progress, of enlightenment, civilizing missions, and the university. The dream, that where scientists see rationally and dispassionately and understand the truth, are enlightened by it, that they'll take it upon themselves to act. And that action, of course, is meant to be the responsibility tied with academic freedom. That they will act despite and, if necessary, against their own interests, whether those interests be related to their social location, their geopolitical grouping, or their own career, and then to strive to find solutions for the betterment of humankind and the planet. But approaches premised on collegial rationality, for the most part, don't lead to the loss of investments and ways of thinking and doing that got higher education in this mess. The types of transformation to which we are referring requires far more substantive engagement, more rupture of sameness, more rupture of legitimations or recognitions, egolatories, for more ethical self-other communal relations, commitments to loss, to gains, and other identities as the institution moves forward. So with the last 10 minutes, I'll quickly outline how I've turned, I guess, to more figurative approaches. Despite my arts background and my belief in the reflective dialogic value of arts-based methods for data generation, which is what you can see here, I was acutely aware of how dismissed such work would be when engaging those within higher education with higher education research output. Esoteric, fluffy, subjective are some of the descriptions. I'd been teaching a course to academics from a South African institution to those within the institution and other South African institutions. And I found that despite our discussions about shifting power, the academic text they were looking at, the stats of what was happening within their classes and outside of it, there was still much missing to shift the commitments of those of us in the room to the common good. So I started this at first finding and sharing books that were coming out at the time, and then building a sort of archive, recognizing the humanizing work within literature, the problematizing that happens within contemporary art practice, and the critical pedagogy of much drama. It was crowdsourced, it still is. Ask folks to add why they suggest it, and then at the time, I tried to have it sort of abut my teaching, but it remained quite peripheral. This is now opened for others who embed it in their online modules, use it in workshops. It's quite expansive, and you're welcome to add to it too. But what I wanted to say is I could see value there. I also really believe there's value in metaphor, where that which is almost impossible to give representation to in words can find more expressive and profound expression in idiom or metaphor. So these are metaphors which participants used when trying to articulate a phenomenon they experienced as academics within higher education. We then placed them on postcards and asked the participants after a focus group to select one of them, to write a message and to address it to the person or people who they wanted to read the research findings. So that really helped with impact. I also think there's much power in the visual, which I think too allows for hidden, repressed, and oppressed traces and signs which persist in life to reveal themselves. For me, the shift from logocentric representation to oculocentric is what we're doing in the world anyway. But what it does is it allows possibilities for how people respond to what is being shared and experienced. So I'd like to use this as a way of example. This was from a project led by Andrea Alcock, who at the time was a master's student of mine, and Dr. Hlengwa at Rhodes University. And Andrea was working at a university at the time, which is majority Black with majority first-generation students. She did this project, and this is the work of a student who used the pseudonym Keith. So Keith represented himself as a chicken in these non-mimetic portraits. On the left, he took a portrait of himself at home. The man, who's his grandfather in his life, is known to the chickens, trusted, looks after them. They engage in the rural space with some protections, some freedoms, as is the right for the living. On the right, this is Keith on campus. Packed for consumption by another, no individuality. Packed for consumption by another, whether that be industry, commerce, the labor market, or the academic. He becomes a product of exchange without life or agency and no individuality. The graduation gown becomes a sort of cling film. His relation to those who care for him, his teachers or family, are not present. What does this say about the misrecognition of those like Keith and of Keith's grandfather? What does this say about higher education? What does it say about Keith's realizations of where he will find flourishing, growth, and happiness? So projects like that were skirting around the issue of impact, but the sharing of the research findings through visuals like the ones I just show you, I think engage people in different ways. This project on screen now is a creative arts project, and it's one where that's we, the research team, engage most directly with the question of impact. The contributors to the project, both the artists and the academics, were more interested in that than the contribution to academic knowledge. They wanted the work to operate by problematizing dominant narratives of higher education, to contribute counter narratives, and also to compose some counter stories that could take others along on a journey for questioning, contestation, and commemoration of the archive of crushed hopes that we have in the majority world as our inheritance. Through the project, first-generation academics shared how they drew on systems of authority that are outside of the university and their disciplinary epistemologies. And those systems of authority were referential frameworks for being and becoming academic leaders, ancestry, religious, spiritual beliefs, traditions of resistance of the subaltern, communism, socialism, service, humanism, motherhood. They're idiocentric individual stories, and they are also unique artworks, but they have with them reverberations, associations beyond specific contexts and time that seem to stay with audience members. 7 videos were produced through various means. We don't really have time to discuss the process. It's in the video paper that you were sent, but they were shown at a colloquium in India, various workshops in India, Angola, and Northern Ireland, and they're also available for others interested in using them in workshops and engagement work. COVID made it really hard to impact this project quantitatively, and funding since then has been almost impossible. But as a pilot project, it was really, really interesting. If you've watched and listened to the video paper that we produced, you would have had a sense of how it moved viewers. So importantly, it raises questions about authority and its relation to authoring, authorship, and academic authors. Those academic authors are actually most silenced via the hidden curriculum of academic schooling, in both the conditioning from education and also the conditioning in how knowledge is produced. And especially when it comes to academics authoring their experiences of change and their experiences of trying to affect change in higher education studies. What was really great was it also allowed us to explore other ways outside of their publications and mine, ways that might be more fit for purpose for impact. To hear, to see, to witness, to write and teach about the struggles for freedom and flourishing that such leaders in higher education negotiate in the university in times of transitions of authority. And then also to engage in dialogue, reflection, and dissent in ways that impact each other's thinking and ways of being conceptually. So my time offering in this now has run out, I think, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and also your experiences.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina. Right on time. Without wasting time, we'll hand over to our discussant. Over to you, Dr. Marguerite.
Thank you, Daisy. I hope it's okay if I share some images from my side, and I'll explain why. See if you can if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay, so first of all, thank you for the invitation to respond to Dina's work. I was very excited to get this invitation because I have read her work and Dina, I think there are many things that we can talk about, but one of the things that I want or how I perceive this is an invitation to respond, but I think the work in itself is an invitation. And I take up the invitation as one that allows me to share visuals, because I also come from an arts background, and sometimes that is, for me, the first and the most intuitive way to respond. So I'm going to just share 5 visuals with you, or 5 slides, and then I'm going to read out some of my thoughts about what is the work that Dina speaks of, and what is impactful work. So in the first place, it is work that takes seriously the challenge of representation and representing lived experiences, and how to move beyond it, to pay attention to the lines of our lives, the detail that disappear, the marks we erase. How do we represent that which is impossible to say? And how do we respond to the things we represent? How do we move beyond representation? Witness, remember, overlook. Findings matter. It is the work of self, identity, and subjectivity as a complex and entangled, layered mess. Displacement, migration, diaspora, and exile. Where is home? Where is the me in this home? And what else shapes me? Framing, split and parallel, self-surveillance we feel. Give me a voice to write myself, to sing my story, to paint my picture. How can I, through this work I do, be, belong, and become? It is the work that makes visible the micro-narratives, the details of lived experience as a form of resistance, movement, border crossing and transgressing, responsibility and resistance, a rupture in the order and organizing, the search for complexity in chaos. Uneasy categories become blurred. Body, mother, me, child, childhood, lost at sea, found in art, tough work, hard work. Painful tears are shed together and alone. It is the work that takes us to a celebration, a wedding of method and theory, to tell an authentic story, to pay attention to the effective and embodied dimensions of being, becoming, and belonging. How do we cross invisible borderlands, making the invisible visible through our research practices? New subjectivities beyond subject-object relationships. The researcher and the researched becomes entangled, and the entanglement acknowledges how awkward or difficult it is. The words get stuck, and the images move. It is the work that invites us to create together, the work that is an invitation to be not alone. Participate, leave your trace, responsibility together. Knowledge is an exchange, not a taking or a giving. Collectively different ways of talking, becoming what is valid, what is valued. How do we help anyone by being here, doing what we are doing, stuck together in higher education? Where do we spend our energy? How do we work? How do we do work that matter and the work that we care for deeply? How do we give the best of us to each other? Thank you. That is sort of the end of my visual response to Dina. I think I just wanted to sort of share some of the things that came to mind when reading and looking at this work. But there are so many more questions that I have, and I think I would like to just ask Dina perhaps to talk more about what she's doing in this project. And I think in terms of impact, it's also something that I realized moving to a new context, how important it is in this context. But I'm interested in how the medium and the art makes this possible in your work, or how you feel that it does.
Marguerite, first of all, thank you. That was so beautiful, so much more beautiful than my hundreds of words. And I really hope that everybody loved seeing it. I was busy taking photos and photos and photos, and I don't know how you feel about sharing it on social media. Would that be okay?
Yes, you're welcome. Most of these artworks I've anyway, used in my own work, so it's out there.
Okay. Lovely. And it almost makes me think we should just, I don't know, have a whole series of dialogues where we just use images and fragments of thoughts, because I think you, I don't know, you managed to evoke so many of the concerns and the ideas. I love this thing of stuck together in higher education. Anyway, okay, your question about the medium. Okay, so that last project, Counter Narratives of Higher Education, that was really interesting because I didn't make the work at all. What I did was to collaborate with Analog Eye Video Arts Africa, which is an artist-run collective with artists who use the moving image, and they come from different contexts. And that it was really amazing because each artist was specifically invited because they were exploring some similar or tangential problematics through their own work that we then had found in either the transcripts or some of the things that the academics were not able to say. And the academics, most of them were saying, we can't express this. We don't have the sophistication that artists do in expressing these issues, and so we want to be paired or whatever. And so the artists spent a lot of time, creating the work, some in dialogue with the academics. I think the moving image is, whether it's through animation or video, can be very powerful because it's a little bit like even this image that we have here. It's not moving, but there's more than one image. There's a narrative being created between images, and the gaps in the narrative, the connections between them, people make those, and so it allows for more of the complexities sometimes that a single image, we rest on it in some ways, or it doesn't take us through something. So that I always think is very powerful. It can be seductive. It can be a bit like watching TV and make people passive. But of course, the joy of contemporary art practice, particularly video art, is, my word, does it make you work to think in terms of what is happening. There's a real burden on the viewer to be active. But one of the difficulties for me in that project was that I had to completely relinquish control. So while when one makes the artworks and you come up with things, in this case, a lot of the academics that I paired with artists were people who I knew through research projects. A lot of them came from those published works that I showed earlier on. I had a sense of where I wanted things to go, even sometimes a sense of how I wanted things to look, and I couldn't do that. And particularly, I know I'm answering quite long here, but I just want to say the one work that I showed with the it's by Eric, I think it's called Untitled, and it was based on the story of it was wow, 80 WhatsApp messages and thousands of words when transcribed of a Syrian woman academic who narrated her life moving between continents. And Eric chose, and rightfully so, it's very impactful, but he chose to focus on the rhythm of the discourse to resist fetishizing trauma, he came up with a very sophisticated visual response. But I was so worried about taking that back to the academic and saying, all your words, all your detail about everything that's happened has now been distilled into an experience that is quite abstracted from what you're saying. I really, was quite worried about that. She just got it immediately. It was really interesting. And of course, we can use her written texts in different ways, but I just wanted to give you a sense of, yeah. So sometimes the choices are a lot more difficult. But then watching that film and engaging in discussion about it with people allows people to have some of these discussions around how one tries to represent these things too, which I think you're totally right. It's an invitation to discussion, which is where some of that power lies.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I absolutely would love to, to talk more about the art aspect of your work specifically, because I'm so interested in that. But also, I like the fact that you mentioned that it's not always, it's not your own art or your own project necessarily, but that that you bring in others and that it's this collaborative process. But I am also aware of the time, and I'm sure there are other people who have a lot of questions for you. So I think I'm going to hand over to Daizy. And we can talk some more. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Dr. Marguerite for the response. Now, at this point, we'll open the floor to those in the room and those joining us online. Any questions and comments are welcome at this point. Feel free to raise your hand if you're online, and even in the room, the floor is open. Okay, online so far we don't have any questions. There's no hand raised in the room.
Maybe,
Yes, Dr. Fitz.
maybe. Thank you so much for the presentation. I guess what I want to find out more on is the analysis of the art or the stories, because what we're doing right now, we're working on a digital storytelling project, and we're having difficulty in analyzing the stories. So what one of the collaborators has suggested is that we do a story of the story. So us researchers write the story about the story. So that's how we're approaching analysis. So I'm wondering how you have approached your own analysis and if you've got any challenges.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's visual analysis, and that is really important. Actually, is to see how to analyze how one image works versus another one, how they work in tandem, those sorts of things. And I think a person should do that. So if you find with the digital stories that's a stumbling block, then bringing in those who know how to analyze visually is a good idea. I don't think so. What I'm trying to say is sometimes what people do is they create a visual artifact and then only use it as a catalyst, a little bit like photo elicitation. But I think it can be both things. And I think there's still real power in the visual for having chosen that in the first place. With that last project that we did, we interviewed the artists and the academics before we even began to say, why would you even be part of this project? We interviewed those who were in collaboration, because we did different processes. Those that were in collaboration, we interviewed them independently during the project. And then afterwards, once the artifact was finished again, we interviewed them. And then once it had been shown and they got a sense of what different people thought, because we showed it, to younger students, older students, academics, those like sort of in sort of women's studies, so much more feminist angle versus. And so once they started getting those viewer responses, we also interviewed them. And so that became a form of data as well about why do things. the discussion with the artists was really important for asking why the timing, why the visuals, what are you trying to communicate, how are you linking that to? But when I think what's different maybe to digital storytelling, which I think can be really amazing, but with contemporary art practice is that the artwork should also exist outside of the artist's intentions. So any of us on some level can be analyzing it outside of those intentions and seeing how things work. And that's where it became really nice also, was that you had an artwork made by a South African, showed within a university in West Bengal, where the interpretations of those who were looking at it were as interesting because it reflected some of their cultural associations, some of their ideas, some of their personal stories. So one can get actually quite a bit of data, certainly a lot more than if you're producing a text, I think, from the visual artifact.
Thank you so much for the response. I think we have almost about 10 minutes. So, yes,
I have a question. I think, thank you very much for the presentation. Mine is in line with the decolonization of higher education. As you were presenting, you talked of creative arts as one avenue that can help, at least in the transformation agenda. So my question is, how then do you guard against appropriation of local knowledges using creative arts? We talked of the project bringing on board different arts projects from African countries. So how do you guard against appropriation of such ingenuity among these African arts?
So you're concerned about the appropriation of local art forms for the purposes of non-local representation, right?
Yes.
Am I right? Yeah. So, well, the artists are themselves local and they're making their work, and a lot of them are engaged with the politics of representation around appropriation. But I think most of them are using contemporary art approaches. So the play between issues of traditional or African art or whatever is quite sophisticatedly handled, you know. I guess there might be a concern, and Edward, you must tell me if this is what you're thinking about, which is that sometimes those researchers from the global north, and now Marguerite and I are now positioned in the global north, right? So we're somewhere in between, neither, who then come and shop for field workers or come and shop for those who will do their work, and they don't get quite paid the same way or the same amount of legitimacy. Am I right that that's part of the concern?
Yeah, legitimacy probably, and also the power balances. Like you are coming from Northern Ireland, yes, you have one foot in Africa, but then how does the issue of power balance comes up, especially when you write, for instance, an article based on that collaboration? I'm sure it would be Queen's University, Belfast, and those probably come from unknown institutions. So how do you handle such things?
Okay, so I mean, I think you're right, absolutely, but it's a little bit more complicated. A lot of those artists are quite esteemed in their own right. Not all of them. Some of them are really early career. Where the power balance was me going really cap in hand in many ways, and I think that's important because it wasn't as if I was offering a layer of legitimacy that mattered to them. I think that is a real problematic, but I think in the case of that project, most of them were really interested as people who were first generation to study art practiced anyway within universities, about universities. So they were doing it as as something that they weren't going to get as much kudos from if they were doing a big art piece that was going to be exhibited in a gallery, which is where that capital comes from, right? When it's come to publications and those sorts of things, I always go back to ask who wants to co-author and who doesn't. And for most part of it, most of them don't want to. They're not really interested in that form of knowledge representation. But I think where the thing comes in of the benefit in a weird way of coming from Queen's is that I was able to get funding for an impact activity that I would not have been able to have gotten back home. And so aspects of their practice that wouldn't have been funded or an engagement that they wouldn't have even tried before, especially, you know, on the fringes of the COVID time, was actually an appreciated aspect. The question of the politics of representation, which is slightly similar but related to what you're talking about, was raised the whole time. So there were issues particularly about first generation, about white-black relations, about who's curating and decides. That's a huge power imposition. We had those discussions the whole way through. And I think that, yeah, I think I was literally challenged the whole time, so that what you land up seeing at the end becomes a lot less directed than if I was the PI of a project. So I think it made it messy in some ways, because you have to engage on issues of power. But it's a different project to one where there's huge amounts of funding, and engaging with academics who are wanting the certain types of capital, which is where you need to think of authorship in a different way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have less than 5 minutes. Any final contribution or question? Yes,
Thank you for the presentation. My question is about impact, and if you've had experience with sort of figuring out how to manage unintended impact. So in a project that Faith and I are working on with young people from Freedom Square in the Free State, we're looking at higher education or access to higher education and how it's shaped within context of social spatial exclusion. And at the end of our workshops, we're using photo voice for the process. There are 3 students who've come back to say, you know, after thinking about all the factors and challenges that I had in accessing higher education, I've actually now decided to give it a go. So they've applied for university. On the one hand, that's great for the impact, you know, report to be able to say to our funders, this is, you know, an outcome of the process. But on the other hand, I was thinking what happens to the students or what happens to these young people thereafter. Because of course, our reporting of the impact is just at the point to say, this is a result of the process. And then once the report is written, that's it. But, you know, I've been thinking more and more about where the boundaries of responsibility are in terms of impact and the kind of inspirational hope that we might give people from using this kind of arts-based participatory methods. Yeah, just it's a question about impact and the boundaries of responsibility.
Beautiful question. And Marguerite, you're welcome to come in as well. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I mean, you know, I think we think about things as some of us as this in terms of ethics, right? It's not ethical compliance. It's our relations with our participants. And we try to think around all the possible things that may happen when we do the research and then afterwards, and how we can mitigate against harms, but also, yeah, I mean, it's lovely to hear that it's had that sort of response. But there are limitations to what we promise. And one of the difficult things, I think, of those of us who research higher education and want things to change, and then what happens if you create that desire and you're not able to impact on access or impact on the belonging of the person. You almost promise something in terms of doing the research. You almost promise that you will find solutions that then will change things. And I don't have an answer to that, except to try to be clear about the limitations when one engages. It's easier when you engage with academics, of course, because academics know even better than you do about the limitations, right? But for me, that was why I wanted to emphasize that thing about the harms that we can do if we don't start to have conversations about impact and the barriers to impact, if we don't start writing about those, because that's where we're not like sort of developing a collective intelligence about how to make our research inform change. So I'm sorry that I don't have a clear answer, but I share the same concern as yours. Marguerite, I don't know if you're wanting to.
Yes, I mean, I think we're pretty much out of time, but for me, I think that is a tricky one, but I do think that in a way it is an issue of control, and in research there are always things beyond your control, just as when you make an artwork, and I think you said it, Dina, you said you don't always you can't, you put something out there, but you can't control how people will respond to it or what will happen with it. But I don't think that should prevent us from sort of, paying attention to these details and somehow trying to not represent but to share. But I don't think you can always, I think it's a tricky one because you can't always control what kind of life it will take. Same with research, but I mean, whether you do a photo voice or arts-based research, or you write an academic paper, I mean, I don't think it's perhaps the responsibility doesn't change.
What's nice, I guess, is with time, one can revisit those that you've engaged with and collect data over time. And that's really lacquer. That's when it goes beyond, as you were saying, the research report. And then one gets to get a sense of how it grew and did things in different ways. And I think many people do that, and I think it's a good move.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Dina and Dr. Marguerite. We have run out of time, but thank you for everyone that participated in the room and also online. Thank you so much for joining us. Please feel free to interact even outside this PBT today. So we'll just give a round of applause to our discussant. So we can end here.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for your time. Keep well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.